They were not supposed to survive. That was the thought running through every German prisoner as the transport truck stopped in the middle of an unfamiliar American-controlled zone in early 1945. The engines cut out one by one. Silence spread across the convoy like a warning. No one spoke inside the trucks, not because they were calm, but because they were waiting for the end. Rumors had followed them for weeks, that American camps were not prisons, that they were processing stations before execution, that surrender was just a delay before punishment. Some believed it completely, others refused to think at all. A young German soldier in the back of the truck kept repeating the same sentence under his breath. "It'll be over quickly. It will be over quickly." Then the doors opened. Cold air rushed inside instantly, and the prisoners froze. They expected shouting, guns, dogs, violence. Instead, there was nothing like that. American soldiers stood in loose formation near the trucks. Weapons were present but not raised, not aimed, just carried. One officer stepped forward holding a clipboard. He looked tired, not angry, not excited, just organized. He spoke in a calm voice. "Prisoners will disembark in order. Medical screening first, then food and shelter. No insults, no threats, no shouting." That alone made several prisoners hesitate before stepping down, because it did not match what they had been told their entire lives. As boots touched the ground, the German prisoners noticed something else. The camp was not chaotic. It was structured. Tents were aligned in straight rows. Vehicles moved slowly and deliberately. Medical stations were clearly marked with red crosses. And there was something even more confusing. No one looked afraid. Not the guards, not the medics, not even the support staff. That calmness felt wrong to the prisoners. One whispered, "Why are they not angry?" No one answered, because they didn't know. They were guided toward the first inspection area. It was a large canvas medical tent, clean, brightly lit, organized like a field hospital rather than a detention site. Inside, the sound changed completely. Outside was silence. Inside was controlled movement, papers turning, metal trays clinking, quiet instructions being exchanged between nurses. A German prisoner later described it as more like a hospital than a prison. That was the first shock. One by one, they were checked. Height, weight, temperature, injuries. Many tried to hide wounds instinctively, expecting punishment for weakness. But nothing happened. No shouting, no anger. Only notes written down calmly. A nurse cleaned a wound on a prisoner's arm and wrapped it carefully. He stared at her hands the entire time. Finally, he asked quietly, "Why are you doing this?" The nurse didn't stop working. She simply said, "Because it needs to be done." That answer did not fit anything he understood. Outside the tent, the smell of food began to drift through the air. It was faint at first, then stronger. Warm bread, soup, something cooked. The prisoners noticed immediately. After years of rationing, starvation, and collapse in Germany, even the idea of consistent food felt unreal. A guard pointed toward another area. "Food will be served after processing. No ceremony, no humiliation, just instruction." And that was when the fear started to change shape, not disappear, but shift. From terror into confusion. As the first group finished medical screening, they were led toward a separate tent. Steam rose from inside. Warm light spilled out through the canvas edges. One prisoner stopped walking. He stared at it. "Is that a bath?" No one answered. Because it was. And inside that tent, the reality of the camp would begin to break everything they thought they knew. But they were not ready for that yet, not even close. The prisoners did not move at first. They stood outside the canvas structure, staring at the rising steam like it was something dangerous. A bathhouse did not belong in their expectations of captivity. In their minds, prisoners were supposed to be broken, not cleaned. One of them finally stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if the ground itself might react. Inside, the air was warm, almost unreal after the cold transport journey. Rows of simple washing stations lined the tent. Clean towels were folded neatly. Soap bars sat untouched, waiting. And then the water started running. Hot water, not lukewarm, not rationed, not limited. Hot, flowing water. The man froze instantly, his hand still under the stream. "It's warm," he whispered, almost disbelieving. Behind him, others slowly began to enter. At first, no one spoke, because speaking would make it real. And they were not ready to accept that reality yet. In Germany, especially in the final months of the war, water had become a luxury in many places. Cold washes. No heating, no stability, no certainty. So standing under hot running water now felt less like comfort and more like something impossible. A young soldier washed his face for a long time without moving, then simply said, "This cannot be real." But it was. After the showers, they were given towels, clean, soft, dry. Many stared at them before using them, as if unsure whether touching them was allowed. Then came clothing, simple uniforms, fresh, folded, not prison rags, not humiliation, just replacement clothing. One prisoner hesitated before putting it on. He looked at the American guard and asked, "Why do we get this?" The guard shrugged slightly. "So you don't get sick." That was all. No ideology, no speech, no explanation beyond necessity. And somehow that made it even harder to understand. Then they were led to the food area. The smell hit them before they saw it. Warm soup, meat, bread, vegetables, real food. Long tables were arranged under a covered structure. Metal trays lined up neatly. Soldiers stood nearby but did not interfere. A voice called out, "Move forward slowly, one at a time." No chaos, no rush, no punishment, just order. The first prisoner approached the serving line. A cook placed food into his tray without looking at him like he was anything other than a person waiting to eat. That detail mattered more than anything else, because for many of them, this was the first time in years they were not being looked at with hatred, fear, or suspicion, just normality. He sat down at the table, did not eat immediately, just stared at the food. Another prisoner sat beside him and whispered, "If this is a trick, it is a very strange one." Then he finally took a bite. He stopped, looked down at the spoon, and said nothing for a long time. Not because it was bad, but because it was the first warm meal he had had in what felt like a lifetime. Around them, the same pattern repeated. Silence at first, then slow eating. Then small changes in expression. Confusion, relief, disbelief. One man quietly said, "I forgot what food tastes like when you are not afraid." No one replied, because everyone understood. After eating, they were not locked away immediately. Instead, they were assigned basic movement rules and guided toward barracks. Simple wooden buildings, clean bedding, individual spaces, not luxury, but order, structure, stability. One prisoner stopped at the entrance and looked inside, then asked softly, "Is this really for us?" The guard answered without hesitation, "Yes." That single word carried more weight than any threat they had expected. Inside the barracks, prisoners sat on their beds in silence, not because they were told to, but because they didn't know what else to do with safety. Outside, American soldiers continued working, calm, coordinated, controlled. No shouting, no cruelty, no revenge, only routine. And for the German prisoners, that routine became the most unsettling part of all. Because everything they had been taught said the same thing: the enemy should hate you. But here, they did not. And that contradiction was starting to break something inside them, something they had relied on for years. And as night approached, the prisoners realized something even stranger. They were not waiting for punishment anymore. They were waiting for meaning, for explanation, for something that would make this world make sense again. But the camp gave them none, only silence and discipline and calmness. And that was when the real confusion began. Not fear, not anger, but the terrifying question they could not answer. If they are not monsters, then what are they? Morning came quietly. No alarms, no shouting, no chaos. Just a bell in the distance, simple, mechanical, almost gentle in its repetition. The German prisoners woke up slowly, still unsure whether what they experienced the day before had been real or just exhaustion playing tricks on their minds. But the barracks were still there: clean beds, folded blankets, structured rows, and outside, movement. Normal, controlled, routine movement. American soldiers walking to assigned duties, medics preparing stations, workers carrying supplies. No anger, no tension, no revenge, just a system functioning, and that was the part they could not understand. After a basic morning meal, the prisoners were assigned tasks, not punishment. Work, simple roles meant to keep the camp running: carrying supplies, cleaning areas, sorting equipment, assisting in kitchens or storage tents. One prisoner looked at the assignment list and frowned. "This is work for prisoners," the guard replied without emotion. "It is work for people who live here." That distinction hit harder than any insult would have, because it implied something they were not ready to accept, that they were not being reduced, they were being included in order. In one section of the camp, a group of prisoners was sent to the supply area. Crates of food, medical equipment, clean uniforms stacked neatly. Everything labeled, everything counted, everything accounted for. One former German corporal stared at the system for a long time, then said quietly, "In our camps, nothing was like this." No one responded, because even the Americans knew what he meant. Later that day, something unexpected happened. A medical assistant, a young American nurse, approached a group of prisoners working near the infirmary. She spoke slowly, making sure they understood. One of the prisoners had medical experience, a former field medic. She handed him a tray. "Can you help organize these supplies?" He froze. "You trust me with this?" She looked at him briefly. "Yes." That single word again, simple, direct, no suspicion attached. Just trust as default, not reward. Inside the infirmary tent, the atmosphere was even more unsettling for them. Not because it was harsh, but because it was precise. Instruments were clean, beds were aligned, patients were treated in sequence, records were updated immediately. No panic, no improvisation born from collapse. Everything had structure. One prisoner watched an American doctor treat a wounded soldier with calm efficiency, then quietly said, "They do not act like they are winning a war." Another replied, "Or like they are afraid of losing it." That realization lingered, because it removed the emotional assumptions they had carried for years. By midday, something else began to shift. Conversation. At first, only small words, questions about tasks, about tools, about routines. Then more. A prisoner asked an American guard, "Why are you not angry at us?" The guard paused for a moment, thinking, then answered, "The war will end eventually. We don't take it with us." No speech, no philosophy, just a sentence. But it stayed in the prisoner's mind longer than anything else. As the day continued, the emotional structure inside the camp began to fracture, not into chaos, but into doubt. The prisoners had prepared themselves for cruelty, for humiliation, for punishment that matched what they had been told to expect. But none of it came. Instead, they were confronted with something far more difficult to process: consistency, order, humanity without explanation. That evening, while returning from assigned work, one prisoner stopped near the fence line. He looked out across the camp. The sun was setting. American soldiers were finishing their shifts. Some were writing letters, others were cleaning equipment. A few were laughing quietly among themselves. No aggression, no hatred, just life continuing. He turned to another prisoner and said, "If this is the enemy, then what were we?" The question hung in the air. No one answered, because there was no easy answer left. That night, back in the barracks, silence was different. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of reconsideration. Beliefs they had held without question were starting to loosen. Not because someone argued against them, but because reality did not match them anymore. And that was more destabilizing than any punishment could have been. And in the middle of that quiet uncertainty, the prisoners understood one thing clearly. The camp was not changing. They were. By the final days, the camp no longer felt like what they had arrived in. It had not changed in structure, the same fences, the same barracks, the same rules. But something inside the prisoners had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Fear was no longer the dominant feeling. It had been replaced by something far more complicated: awareness. The routine continued. Morning bell, assigned work, meals, medical checks, structured movement between zones. Everything predictable, everything controlled. But no cruelty. That was the part that refused to fit into their expectations. Because they had been trained, explicitly or indirectly, to believe control required violence. Yet here, control existed without it. One morning, a prisoner who had initially expected execution stood near the infirmary entrance. He watched American medics move between patients. No shouting, no humiliation, no unnecessary force, just treatment, just procedure. A nurse passed him and nodded slightly, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as someone present in the same space. He later said quietly, "That was the moment I stopped waiting for punishment." Inside the camp, more prisoners began to speak openly, not about ideology, not about politics, but about confusion, because what they were experiencing did not match what they had been told for years. One man said, "If they were cruel, I would understand it." Another answered, "But they are not, and that is harder." That was the truth none of them expected. Kindness, when unexpected, can be more destabilizing than violence. A week later, notice of transfers began. Some prisoners would be moved to other facilities, some would be processed for repatriation later. There was no ceremony, no dramatic announcement, just lists, just logistics, just movement. On the morning of departure, the camp was quiet. The same structured order, the same controlled environment. But now the prisoners walked through it differently. Not with fear, not with panic, but with thought. They noticed details they had ignored before: a guard fixing a fence carefully, a medic helping another soldier without urgency, a shared meal being served with the same routine respect as always. Nothing had changed, except them. As trucks prepared to leave, one prisoner stood for a moment longer than the rest. He looked back at the camp, at the tents, at the infirmary, at the people who had treated him not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a human being to be processed, cared for, and eventually released. Another prisoner asked him, "What will you say when you get home?" He hesitated, then answered, "I will say we were wrong about many things." The truck doors closed, engines started, and slowly the camp disappeared behind them. No cheers, no hatred, no victory chants, just departure, just silence. And inside that silence, a realization settled across many minds at once. The most difficult thing they had experienced was not captivity. It was contradiction. Because everything they believed about the enemy had been simple, clear, certain. But reality had not been. Reality had been structured, calm, and unexpectedly humane. And that broke certainty more than anything else could. Years later, some of those prisoners would speak about it, not as a story of propaganda, not as a political argument, but as a memory that refused to fit neatly into categories. They remembered the hot water, the clean bandages, the calm voices, the meals served without humiliation, and most of all, the absence of the thing they had been prepared for their entire lives: cruelty. And when they tried to explain it, they often returned to the same sentence: "We expected monsters. We found people doing their job," because in the end, the war did not only end on battlefields. It ended in places like this: quiet camps, structured routines, small decisions repeated every day, where humanity was not announced, but simply practiced. And that is what stayed with them long after the uniforms were gone. Not fear, not hatred, but the unsettling truth that the world they believed in was never as simple as they were told.